Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Faruk Rahmanovich and I'm joined today by Brother Kareem.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
In this series we're doing a chapter by chapter exploration of Sayyid Hussein Nasr's book, A Young Muslim's Guide to the West. We'll be focusing on one portion of a chapter in these sessions and delving more deeply into ideas within the passage, like what implications can you draw, conclusions you can come to, and showing you how to read these kinds of complex texts more carefully. In today's session, we'll be looking at Chapter 6, Literature and the Arts. So, how do you feel about literature and the arts?
Well, for me, the arts have never been something that I've paid a ton of attention to, really. Not that artistically inclined, really. I can't really get beyond stick figures when it comes to drawing.
Wait, drawing?
Yeah.
Drawing? How do you say it?
I really didn't hear any difference in your pronunciation between those two.
I heard drawing. Like a W, as in like you said two U's, drawing.
Drawing? Okay.
Sorry, dude. Sounds like we might have said bag. Would you like that in a bag?
Let's remember here that I'm the one without an accent.
Whatever, I got Chicago accent, son. You got that.
No.
Is it
I'm
North Carolina?
No, mostly New Jersey.
Jersey?
Actually, you can actually find these like quizzes online. Most quizzes online are absolute garbage, but there was one that was conducted by this group that did this big study where they went around the country and asked people all these kinds of questions about how they pronounced words, or how they or what words they used in different situations. I think the New York Times had it on their website for a long time. You may be able to find it there still. But I took this, and they ask 20, 30 questions, whatever it is, and they'll kind of tell you for each question, like, how different people in the country answered that question for you, and by the end they kind of put it all together. And I was thinking, like, oh, I'm going to end up with some kind of mix. It was like, no, it's New Jersey and New York. Really. It's all from there. There's a little bit of North Carolina in there every once in a while. And I don't know, I guess I picked up a little bit of Chicago along the way. But no, it's mostly New Jersey. And people from New Jersey and New York are the ones who will tell you they have no accent.
Sure.
Everyone else after that then developed accents based off of different parts of the country.
I just think it's funny that that New Yorkers would hey, you talking to me? Like that's considered the no accent. Snooki apparently has no accent, right?
Well, that's an extreme version. That's like
hold on, you can't have an extreme version of no accent.
Fair enough. That's an extreme kind of accent there. But it is funny because, we live in Chicago here, and the stereotypical Chicago accent. How many people do you know who actually talk like that?
And I don't know anybody who
Yeah,
talks
I
like
know.
that.
It's like a very small subset. Mostly working class people from the city, which again is a dwindling group of people. And yeah, that group has fallen away. I used to have an acquaintance who was a guy in his 60s, an Irish dude. He grew up in the city. He's from an actual Irish neighborhood in Chicago, and now you just don't find all that much of that anymore.
Yeah,
a lot of this moved out to the suburbs.
Yeah, well, it's. I was actually just having a conversation with Maida about this a couple of days ago. We were driving through Chicago. She was commenting on the sort of the hipster gentrification of various neighborhoods. Because we drove from like maybe 4,000 north down to like 8,000 south along Lakeshore, so like you see the entire thing. And I thought, like, all right, like, why did this whatever Mexican neighborhood or Polish neighborhood stop being Mexican or Polish with the introduction of hipsters?
Mm-hmm.
And as I thought about it, I'm like, okay, well, these people didn't want to live in a Polish neighborhood or a Mexican neighborhood, but there were certain preferences they had, like access to certain kinds of food, right? Or maybe proximity to their relatives, or something like that that would have been more readily available there. And then as hipsters move in, what the neighborhood desires, the sort of the demand side changes. Now, oddly enough, or ironically enough, the hipsters moved in because it was ethnic, but by their moving in, they made it non-ethnic, right? And now they imported, whatever. It's no longer like a crappy little,
David.
exactly,
Yeah.
right? Like it's no longer like the little, crappy bodega on the corner. Now, well, that they're hipsters, you can charge them more, and so a Whole Foods moves in, and a Starbucks moves in, and all of these little cookie cutter things move in rather than whatever the local thing is. And the fact of the matter is, those local things were only there because of what the demand was, right? It's not like they have some sort of historic claim on these like 4 square blocks being Polish or something. Like it just so happens that was a neighborhood that a couple of Polish people moved in, and then the subsequent Polish people that moved in happened to have moved in next to them because they're like, hey, other Polish people, I can speak
I think
Polish.
it's more than happened to have moved in, right? It's deliberate in
Well,
that
right,
sense.
right,
So,
yeah.
like,
It's not. It's
we
not
want
an
to we
incident.
want to be around people who speak our language, who share our culture, and that's how you get these neighborhoods built up in the first place.
Yeah, but then the question is like, do those people really want to stay living there?
Right.
Or did they move there because it was the only place, or one of very few places, that was available that catered to some of those desires that these people had, like the ability to speak their own language, the access to food from wherever they're from. Like still, like in parts of Chicago, you will find very high concentration of Bosnian stores, and that's because at the time, like in the 90s, there was essentially no import of goods from that former Balkans area, and so like it would be the Bosnian equivalent of Bob, right? Mujo would like go out and get like a container, and he'd pay like $5 grand for a shipping container, and then he'd load it with whatever he could buy over there and drag it over here, and it would be only his store that had it, right? And then everybody'd want to go there. Well, times change. Shipping is faster. Pete's right here around the corner has like most of that stuff now, right? Because they cater to a broader audience, and that sort of like living on top of each other, the way you do in highly urbanized centers, that isn't very appealing to people who want to have more kids, right? If you're not a fan of your neighbors knowing everything that's happening in your house, then you really can't do city living. Like, you need the burbs. And plenty of people sort of decided to opt for that. On top of that, if you're actually renting those places, and a lot of those people did, the rents are going up precisely because these hipsters are moving in. And so you can charge, instead of like whatever, $800 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment, now you can charge like $2,200, because in a 2-bedroom apartment you'll have 3 hipsters living there, and they'll split the cost, and that'll be fine, right? So living there becomes more expensive because the hipsters want to move in, but once they move in, because they bring their preferences with them, oddly enough, they sort of take out the entire sort of ethnic feel of a neighborhood, and they sort of, I don't want to say whitewash it, but I'm trying to think, have I ever seen a black hipster? And I don't think I have. So like maybe whitewashing it is about
maybe if you
accurate.
Maybe if you focus specifically on hipsters, right? But at the same time, there have been a lot of other, immigrant groups who have come to the country who basically, claimed an area. Like, say, when Dacey's moved in and to the Devon area, they kind of claimed it as theirs. I'm actually not sure it was there beforehand, but I'm sure something was there beforehand. They moved in, and all of a sudden that something isn't there anymore, and it turns into a Dacey neighborhood instead.
Well, the difference there being that the Daceys didn't move in there because they wanted the ethnic feel of whatever was there before, right? They wanted to bring their culture, and they did so very successfully there, right? So like, they're not lamenting the fact that whatever was there is gone, as opposed to hipsters who specifically lament the fact that now that there's no Polish people in the neighborhood, it's no longer a Polish neighborhood. And the introduction of the hipster drove out the Polish people from the neighborhood.
So yeah, I mean that's kind of where the criticism there comes from, is the idea that it essentially functions like locusts, right? The hipsters are like locusts, you know. They've moved into an area, they've completely destroyed it. And what do? Well, they now move on to the next area.
Yeah,
right?
They've stripped all the ethnic right out of the neighborhood,
and yet, despite all of that, I'm still not a fan of the criticism of gentrification. I really don't get it, because, you know, I mean, these neighborhoods, like this particular 4 square block area or something like that, why does it have to stay the same forever? There's no inherent reason why it must not change, why it must not evolve. So that seems to be the underlying idea behind the criticism of gentrification there, which is, oh, it is this, and we feel that it should stay that into perpetuity.
Yeah,
right?
There is this almost like historicism to it, where you know, things have to be preserved the way they were when you like them. But it's like, hold on a second, the people who lived there wanted a better neighborhood, right? Like, it might have gotten run down, and then they're doing the renovations, and as they're doing renovations, it's not like they have some sort of a central planning committee for how to make it all feel this. Like, no, everybody's updating and upgrading things.
It happens all organically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a thing you can say for gentrification, is that quite often it doesn't happen very organically. Once you see that a neighborhood might be up and coming, what happens is a bunch of investors come in, they buy up the property, developers walk in, tear it down, build up new sort of cookie cutter looking things, and that's that. But on the other hand, if those Polish people who were there before, if they had had the capital to knock down the buildings that were there before and to build new ones, they would have do, right? Like, a city is not it's not a thing set in stone unless you're from like unless your buildings are literally, you know,
like the Stone Age.
Yes,
right.
like you
literally
actually do live in rock.
stone.
But yeah, I mean, it changes, it evolves. Actually, I don't like evolve. It adapts to the needs and demands of the people who happen to be there, and people who are there change, and even that happens organically, right? Some people want to leave. I mean, this is America, right? It's not Europe. Like, in Europe, you don't move out of whatever neighborhood you were born in, essentially, unless war forces you out. Like, I can't think of anybody from anything like a major city in Bosnia who's ever moved out for a job. Ever. It's considered insane. And this is America. You just up and move because, like, rent's cheaper by like 20 bucks, you know, 8 miles that way.
Yeah.
Like, it's so that there isn't that same thing, and this idea of like trying to push that on people seems a little funky.
And I think it also ignores the fact that when they do move out, like let's take Polish for an example here. Let's say there's a Polish neighborhood and they get priced out of the neighborhood, or maybe they leave even before that happens, right? A lot of times they tend to go to a similar kind of place anyway, like maybe somewhere in the suburbs, right? Like where we live, there's a massive Desi population around here, and the result of that is there are a bunch of Desi stores.
Yeah, and a couple of mosques. There's a couple of temples too.
Yeah. If you go down towards the Orland Park area, you will find entire blocks where all of the stores have signs written in Arabic. Right? A whole lot of people moved into that area, and they were all Arab speaking. And so, what did they want? They wanted places where they could get, you know, Arabic food, coffee, etc. Right? And so, especially close to the masjid, which is Mosque Foundation over there, you'll find tons of Arabic places over there. So the neighborhood was something else before that. Then the masjid came in. They actually made the neighborhood a lot better. Right? If you look at the quality of houses that have been built around there and such, I mean, there's a lot of really nice houses right around that area too. But yeah, they made it something different, Yeah, they were very successful. It's funny, just going back to the Starbucks thing for a second. I believe, again, it was New York Times. I saw this one infographic they did where they said, all right, we're going to blur out everything of the cities except we're going to put little green dots for the locations of all the Starbucks in that city. Can you guess which city it is? And most people could tell. Like, for example, with New York City, they're like, yeah, there's Manhattan, right? Because, Manhattan's its own little island right over there. I mean, it's incredible. So, I mean, that kind of shows, like, people look at it like, yeah, we know where the economic centers are in this city, right? And we know where the types of places where the Starbucks are going to be built. Whether it's the economic centers or the places that are wealthy or even middle class areas. And you can kind of get a picture of what the city looks like from there. But yeah, anyway, like I get the whole argument that it prices people out of a neighborhood. That's maybe the one, that criticism and what you said before about how it doesn't seem like it's really organic and it creates these cookie cutter kinds of things. I can see that, but at the same time, if there wasn't the demand for it, it wouldn't happen, right? So people will. We had a conversation about this, a couple hours ago. I mentioned, that's the thing about capitalism is that if there's a way to make money off of it, people will find a way to do that, right? If the demand didn't exist, it wouldn't happen, right? Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for that subject. So let's move on.
I think that's a pretty good intro
Let's
for
take a look
the
at
focus here.
Right. That's nice. All right. Well, I'm sure we can find a lot of ways to connect that to what we're going to talk about here. So let's move on. Let's take a look at what Sayyid Hossein Nasr has to say, and we are looking specifically at the section where he talks about the Islamic city here and architecture. So let's take a look at page 111. And there's some interesting things in the paragraph before it, but we're going to focus on the middle paragraph of page 111. He says, one of the most remarkable features of the Islamic city, as traditionally understood, is its total integration into its natural habitat and its harmony with the climate and other natural conditions. The Islamic city was never built to assert man's opposition to nature. Rather, it was always constructed in harmony with the forces and elements of nature. Maximum use was made of light, wind, shade, and accessible materials, and materials were used in such a way as to always go back to the bosom of nature once the city was abandoned. The Islamic urban sites, whether they be in North Africa, Yemen, Persia, or elsewhere, reflect to this day some of the most successful examples of the integration of the human habitant into the natural environment. In this age of ecological crisis, there is much to learn from traditional Islamic urban planning, as well as the architecture of individual buildings. So he's presenting a perspective on Islamic cities, the traditional Islamic cities, that seems almost alien, or it's foreign to our understanding of the city. Right? When we think of the city, what do we think of? Right?
It's a blight on the land. Cities are, by the way, historically speaking, cities are parasites. They are, because a city cannot, by definition, be self-sustaining. Entirely too many people, not enough food produced within the city, and so you have this like one little dot that is sucking up the resources of a much larger area just to make it self-sustainable.
Right, look at the classic cities in ancient Greece, right? The
Yes.
city-states, right? An entire state that's organized around one city because it needs all of that surrounding area to, provide for it.
Or Rome, it might be even a more hardcore example. Rome was never able to feed itself, ever. They had to import grain from Egypt in order to keep starvation off. Like that's not a small problem. That is a dependency on a foreign nation for your own survival. That's iffy.
Sure. So then the question becomes, well, why do they even exist then? Right? I mean, it would seem, based off of what we talked about before, it would seem that there wouldn't be much good reason for cities to exist, right? They don't seem to be particularly productive in that regard. So then the answer has to be, well, they must provide some other benefit or benefits. They must be productive in other ways.
Or at least they must appear to be. That's that's sort of part of what Nasr is saying here, right? Like what a city used to be as opposed to what a city is. We tend to get in the groove of doing things a certain way. So, for example, we build cities, and we build them initially because we perceive them to be giving us something, and maybe we do get that something out of it. But then time goes on, and we just assume that the reason for building the cities is the same, even though it's not really, right? We've abandoned an idea, sake of argument. These little subdivisions, like residential subdivisions.
Sure. Yeah.
The idea was, it's like a neighborhood that is by itself. Like, when's the last time you were actually in a neighborhood, like where people actually know each other? Like, never. So we build these subdivisions as neighborhoods, but they don't serve that function, and they never will.
Right. Most of the people there don't know each other or really interact with one another at all.
And have no interest in being neighborly by any definition of that word.
And yet, sometimes it just happens organically, but not in subdivisions. So, again, with where we are, have you heard of Surrey Drive? No? You need to spend more time with Dacey's then. So, there is a neighborhood. It's located right around the border of Lombard and Glen Ellen, right by Roosevelt Road. Over there, it's basically just before 355. You know what I mean? If you're traveling west. Right over there, there is a massive concentration of Dacey's who all live right over there, and one of the roads is called Surrey Drive. There's a few others that are right there. So sometimes people will just say Surrey as shorthand for that little area right there.
Is this like south side of Roosevelt?
No, it's just north of Roosevelt.
Oh, okay. Then I don't know the one you're talking about.
Okay. Well, a good friend of mine used to live there as well. And it was funny because, like half of his family members lived there too. But yeah, I mean, so it kind of grows up organically. Right? One person moves there. Oh, hey, this is nice. They tell their family members. Before you know it, half their family members have moved to a house that's close by there as well. Now you've got your own little community there. They know each other. There are other Dacey's who are friends of theirs who move into that area, for example. And now you basically built up a community organically. Yeah. And it's interesting because a lot of these cities, I do think that they started out organically. Right? You talked about them kind of being built, but Chicago started as a trading post. One dude decided that this happened to be a good place to have a trading post. And I assume other people then said, hey, we'll settle down right around here too. And once you get to a certain point, then people will start treating it like a destination. Other people will come there. I think it was Detroit started as a fort. Several of these did. Several major American cities started as forts, essentially, which makes a lot of sense from the perspective of protection, right? So, but still, people have to choose to go there. And then once it gets to a certain size, you're like, all right, now we need a butcher. All right, now we need a baker. That kind of thing, right? And it's like, okay, now we need real roads, right? Now we need a real government to handle all of these things when it reaches a certain size, right? And so I think a lot of these weren't planned in that same sense of it's like, well, we are definitely putting a large city right here. And it's also part of the reason why you find, especially as you move farther west, I think it's farther west through the country, you'll find more cases, especially out here in the Midwest, where the capital of a state is nowhere even close to its biggest city.
Yep.
Right? Springfield. What's the capital of Missouri? You got no idea, do you?
The boy?
What did you say?
No, that's
Des Moines? That's
no.
Iowa. No. The capital city of
Dubuque?
I think that's in Iowa too.
Oh, man, I know all these Iowa cities apparently.
No, the capital of Missouri, I'm going to look up its size right now as well. It's called Jefferson City.
Oh, Jesus.
Let me see if I can find its size here. because just so you can get an idea. Oh,
Poor people.
43,000 as of the 2010 census. That's how small it is.
What's St. Louis at? How many million?
Probably at least 2 million. I'd have to estimate for St. Louis. But yeah, now, when Missouri first became a state, they probably thought Jefferson City was the biggest thing in the whole state at that point. Same thing for Springfield, right? When
Chicago
Illinois
was a swamp.
When Illinois became a state, they probably thought, oh, Springfield is the place to be in Illinois. Let's start out over here. So anyway, I think some of this happens organically, right? It could be location-based. Chicago obviously has a great location for shipping, right? Right on Lake Michigan.
It does now.
Yeah.
Now that we've literally drained a swamp that was there and made it accessible.
Sure. Yeah, sure. It took some time to get there.
And anybody who goes down to Lake Michigan, like downtown, take a look at how deep that water starts out. Right, you're at 10, 20 feet, off the edge of the walkway, and then it's straight down into the water, 10, 20 feet. So that wall wasn't there naturally. So figure out how much flat land that much water would have been eating up if it hadn't been blocked off and then the rest of it drained. The entire downtown area would just be awash in marshes. Yeah, maybe not a very natural seeming choice under natural conditions.
Right.
But somebody went well, you gotta turn around this marshland in order to go up north. Maybe here might be a decent way.
Yeah. Also, obviously, when railroads became a thing, Chicago became the railroad center of the country because, you want to connect east to west. Well, what's in the middle? Well, we're in the middle. Yeah.
Other than Jefferson City, apparently.
Yeah. Oh, God. It's crazy. Illinois has more railway fatalities than any other state in the country. Cars hitting, or trains hitting cars, although I suppose the cars can also hit the trains.
The train might not notice.
Yeah, the train will definitely not notice if a car hits it. But yeah, no, because we have so many railways crossing the state, and a lot of them are still used for things.
Yeah, and apparently, despite having had railways for 150 years, we still haven't caught on to the fact that standing in front of an oncoming train is not the wisest idea you could have.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, there's still too many of them that don't have proper crossing guards. There are ones that have nothing.
I know, man.
Those are typically in rural areas, but yeah, you'll find roads that have no crossing guard at all.
But in that case, don't you come to a complete stop, roll down your
You
windows,
should
listen
be
very
careful.
carefully, and then zoom.
Well, unfortunately, if it's the middle of the night and you're drunk or something like that.
Well, that's a whole separate set of problems, I think.
Yeah, right. I think that's where a lot of these things tend to come from.
I think if you're drunk, the gates aren't going to help you either. It's not like they're titanium or anything. You can drive right through that.
Yeah. Oh well. Anyway, that's its own issue with city planning there, right? I'm sure the city had to be completely redesigned for the whole railway system coming in. And I mean, if you want to talk about something that doesn't look natural at all, that seems to have no place in the natural world, have you ever been flying over the city as you're coming into O'Hare and you've seen those railway yards?
Yes, the massive ones.
I mean, seriously, it looks like something out of a Terminator movie or something, right? I mean, it's just a mass of steel everywhere, and that's one of the things that really stands out to me. It's not in this paragraph, but it's in the next paragraph, where Nasr talks about color. He says the traditional Islamic city is either white, as one finds in North Africa, or even in southern Spain, which to this day reflects its Muslim past, or the color of earth, as one finds in Persia, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And it seems like the typical Western city is gray. It is the color of steel, basically.
We're moving on to blue now with all the windows.
Oh, God.
Over to steel.
Yeah. And we all know how the birds feel about that.
Yes. Splat.
That's a great example of the law of unintended consequences, right? If you do something, you are not guaranteed to get the consequence you want out of it, but you are guaranteed to get some unintended consequence to come as a result of it. So yeah, I'm sure the guys who say like, hey, let's put blue windows in, were just thinking to themselves, we want it to look pretty. We don't want people to be staring at, steel all day long. And then the birds looked at it like, sky, and ran right into it.
Well, I mean, that might have the benefit of reducing the pigeon population in Chicago.
I don't think it's the pigeons all that much. It's funny, not to take us too far off topic, but a few years ago, I was just thinking about, global warming and things like that, and I was wondering, we talk a lot about who's going to lose. And of course, the answer is a lot. A lot of species are going to lose out or are going to be harmed as a result of global warming. But I wondered, is anyone going to actually benefit from this? Like, are there any species out there that are actually better off in this new environment that we've created? And pigeons are one of them. Pigeons have been massively successful.
Pigeons, rats, roaches.
Yeah. Oh, God. Well, at least the pigeon is a little appealing.
Oh,
They're
come
not
on.
quite
It's
as
a rat with
unappealing.
wings.
The pigeon's a little appealing, right? Its actual name is the rock dove. And yeah, I mean, they typically nested on cliff faces, like rocks and things like that. Well, guess what? Skyscrapers work pretty well too for that same purpose. Or the underside of a bridge works really well for that same purpose. Pigeons are also not picky at all about what they eat.
Hence rats, yes.
So they have no problem at all eating stale bread, eating out of the trash. And on top of that, pigeons are one of the species that reproduces based on how much food is around.
Oh.
So if there is more food, they will reproduce at a greater rate. And so therefore, in a city where there is an abundance of trash, and even people who will willingly feed them on top of the food that they can just scavenge, yeah, you shouldn't be all that surprised that pigeons are, becoming, really numerous, really populous in a lot of cities. So yeah, they're one of the species that actually benefits from this whole situation. That is not an argument in favor of global warming. It's just the kind of thing that's an interesting factoid. Anyway, that is not how the traditional Islamic city worked at all, right? If we go back to the first sentence of the first paragraph that we looked at there, right, it's that one of the most remarkable features of the Islamic city, as traditionally understood, is its total integration into its natural habitat and its harmony with the climate and other natural conditions. So, and then he expands this in the next sentence. He doesn't say it outright, but the Western approach here is more one that's focused on the idea of controlling nature.
Right.
Right, as you pointed out before, draining a swamp in order to make a city. New Orleans is another great example of that. I mean, they literally built a city in a place where you should not build a city at all. Right?
If rats are unwilling to come into your city, you probably built the city in a bad place.
But no, we wanted a city there. I mean, it's great for commerce, right? It's right on the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River. Great. It's a great location from a commercial standpoint. Terrible location from a flooding standpoint.
Well, I mean, all of Netherlands is technically underwater. They just they build their levees better. There's a great thing I picked up from Peterson there, that the way they built their levees is you figure out what's the absolute worst flooding catastrophe you can have in the next 1,000 years, and then you build for that. And we go like, well, what's the average for the next 100 years? And yeah, that means that if you ever have a problem year, you're going to have terrible outcomes. But the sort of going off of this idea of integrating in your natural habitat, for some of these things, it's not that he's wrong, it's not that he's trying to be very romantic about it, but there is something, I think, to be said for a smaller population and the inability to produce stuff like structural steel on a mass scale, right? And what that does is it means that you have to turn around and find ways of building in a way that fits the environment that you happen to be in. So I think it's sub-Saharan Africa. Is it North Africa or sub-Saharan Africa? I can't remember now. They build these homes out of mud, right? But they built them with a cooling system set up. And it's a natural cooling system. So you have this hut, and it's not really a hut. I mean, it's much bigger than a hut. And what you do is you sort of line the floors across the whole thing with clay, and you go in a couple of feet, and then there's like a little dip in the. So you go a little bit deeper down, and then you have a flat area, and then it dips again, then it dips again, and then like at that last chamber, like after the last dip, you have this sort of like a tall chimney-like structure that goes above the entire room. And so what you have is cold air drops, right? And so as you have this slope into the home, it's cooler and cooler air the deeper you get in. And then you have that chimney, which is going to be, one, drawing out any hot air, but two, it's going to create a pressure difference, which means you're going to be pulling in new air from the outside, so you have natural circulation built in. And because the whole thing is made of mud, all you have to do is like leave it alone for like 2 years, and it will like sink back into the earth, completely decompose. Now, you compare that to something like Americans in the Middle East, which requires a whole lot of diesel generators and a whole lot of fuel coming in on the daily, because the temperature needs to be like whatever, 68 degrees. I don't think anybody keeps it that low over there, but you know, you get the idea, right? They're sort of artificially forcing the environment. Oh my God, I think I just got a cool analogy. Let's check it out. The same way that like here we produce like Kraft cheese, which isn't cheese, but the idea is that it needs to be absolutely uniform in color, in flavor, in smell, in all the rest of these things. The same way that every single McDonald's across this country will give you the same burger, right? That's what we're trying to do to our cities, to our habitat environment sort of thing, right?
Standardization.
And it's that trying to do that without taking into account the fact that you're not in the same place. Like if you're from Florida and you're used to the temperature is never like dipping outside below, like, I don't know, we get like 2-3 days of like freezing weather a year maybe. And then you move to Chicago and you're like, but I want it to be just like where I came from. Well, first off, then go back to where you came from. Right? If you want it to be just like that, go back to that, because those are the natural circumstances in which you have that experience. Chicago just isn't Florida. But then the idea is like, no, let me force Chicago to behave as Florida does. And to do that, I can't work with the environment. I have to actively work against it, because I have to torture it into this new shape that says Florida instead of Chicago, despite being halfway up to the North Pole from Florida. So yeah, it's that's the sort of problem that we have in the modern setup, and maybe at least a part of that comes from the idea that what I want is better than what I have been given. Right? The context of Chicago is like, this is what summers look like, this is what winters look like. You kind of have to deal with that. And I think traditionally Muslims would look at that and go like, okay, well, that's reality. How do I fit into this reality? Everything has a purpose, including the god-awful winters up here. So how do I fit into these god-awful winters up here? But if you have a sense that the only things that are valuable are things that you happen to value, then there's no reason to allow things to exist outside of your scope of preferences. So you get to destroy everything else.
Right. Or there's no reason to learn how the people who are from that place originally made it work. Right. So when I think about your example of Africa, one of the first things I thought of was, They probably didn't figure that out like right away. I mean, people lived there for a long period of time. They experimented with a lot of different things, and then eventually they figured out this is the best way to build our houses so that we're not sweating constantly, right? And the same thing, for the Native Americans who lived in the area around Chicago. They figured out over time that this is the best way to live. And so if you move into a new place, you have two choices. You can learn from the people who are there. You can say, hey, how do you do things? All right, let's do things like that. Or you can say, no, I'm going to keep doing things my way. How can I change the environment to make it work the way that I want it to be?
Yeah, I think to go with that, I don't think that we're forced to reduce our way of being to like whatever it is that the North Africans of 1,000 years ago figured out, right? Like you don't have to live in little teepees here if you're going to live in Chicago, but that way of taking into account that what this place is and what its purpose is, and that I think it's just that it's the idea of a thing having a purpose and a value in and of itself, so that if you are going to deny its value, if you're going to say something like this is bad weather, and mean it not in the sense of like this weather is annoying me because it's interfering with my plans.
There's a moral value put to it.
Yes, that then it's all good, right? Like you go like, okay, this weather is not very conducive to whatever hospital conditions. Like if you're in Florida, sterile conditions are really not hot and humid, right? Like that's the opposite of what you're trying to do. And so you can say something like, this is a bad climate for a thing, right? And then you either need to figure out how to do that thing within that climate, or in rare cases you might go like, okay, how do I exclude the weather from this because I need a operation room that's not going to kill my patients by default. But I feel like what we're doing, generally speaking, now as opposed to what used to be done, and it's not just the Islamic city, although definitely that was that used to be the case, is we are much more about that standardized way of looking at things. I could throw you into a subdivision anywhere from New York to LA, and they would all look and feel the same. And you go like, how do you do that throughout like 18 different climates? Like that doesn't seem right. You're not working with the environment. You're actually like actively fighting it. And this idea of like we're fighting against nature means that we feel like we can win, and that to me seems a little silly, because eventually, right, nature wins. Right? Look at all of California. Between wildfires and earthquakes, it's game over. Like the moment the earth decides to like sneeze a little violently, you're not going to have a state.
Well, that's one of the main themes of Final Fantasy VII, dude. Right?
Nice.
That's literally one of the main themes of it, right? How does it end again? The last scene, the city of Midgard has been, reduced back. They basically come back to nature. It's all plants and everything surrounding it now. Whereas at the beginning, what were they doing? They were literally drawing the life essence of the earth out of it and using it as energy. Of course, it's an evil corporation that's doing this, right?
Oh, of course.
But yeah, and the good guys start off as eco-terrorists, in effect, at the beginning of the book, right? Although I'm not sure they necessarily have that great higher purpose or something. They want to return it back. They just anti-evil corporation, basically. But yeah, I mean, that's one of the messages they're trying to tell. And when did that come out? Mid-90s?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would have been like 94, maybe?
These are not new ideas. Then again, of course, I mean, when did Nasr write this book?
Mid-90s.
Right? Around the same time there, so... Yeah, people were
Did
already
he
thinking about these
plagiarize Final
ideas.
Fantasy?
Yeah, I'm sure he plagiarized Final Fantasy in making his stuff.
Uh,
No, that's an interesting point. That a lot of people can come from different backgrounds and can still see the same things and reach similar conclusions.
So the architecture and city building, I think, are very interesting. Now, this is from some of the earlier paragraphs, but I do think it bears noting. The way that the different areas of the city were built up. So the sort of first thing that gets built is a mosque. And the reason for that isn't just that we're so religious that, but it's that the mosque does a number of things, and we're used to thinking of mosques as it's a place where you go to pray and then you're done. But mosques used to be the all of your primary education for everybody in the neighborhood, Muslim or not. I mean, Fibonacci, his father was a trade rep for Florence, I want to say, in Tunisia, and he took little Fibonacci with him, and little Fibonacci got his education at the Grand Mosque in Tunisia. And that included math and rhetoric and all the rest of that. So Fibonacci comes back home and then writes a book of numbers of the math that he learned while in the Islamic world. I mean, it's essentially like up to like high school level math in the Islamic world, and he becomes super famous for that in Europe. I mean, obviously the guy innovates a lot, but you start off with that building, and then you add other things around it. Things like whatever, as primary school, you add a high school, you add some sort of a hospital, something along those lines. And the trick was, as you built this, you didn't want it to be dependent on anyone. Right? You don't want it to be dependent on the government, on the authorities, on the goodwill of the people, none of that. And so you end up with what we call the waqf setup. In other words, the mosque and the school and the high school, like they're this like little center, and then around that you set up a series of storefronts that you then rent out, and the profits coming in from those storefronts then actually pay for the maintenance of the mosque, and for hiring the teachers and paying the doctors and all the rest of that. And like this thing sort of grows organically, so the government can rise and fall, but like that institution stays. And you see a lot of very sort of clearly defined versions of this in places like Turkey and Bosnia. In fact, if you're ever in Istanbul, underneath the Sultan Ahmed, the Blue Mosque, you have that like giant plateau where that mosque is located, and then that's east of it, right? There's like a drop off in the walls, and then you have that. It's like maybe a 2-3 street market. There's like a whirling dervish there, and musical programs and things of that nature. That entire thing, along with some other things around there, are part of the waqf for the Blue Mosque. Like that is how that mosque is maintained, right? It's off of people's private economic concerns. So you're never asking for charity.
Yeah, I mean, I've wondered for years now. I don't know if there's a legal reason for it. There could be. It's not something I've really examined. But I've wondered why masjids here in the U.S. don't do something like that. I mean, we rely on donations, and I mean, it's just not sustainable in the sense that you have no guarantee that they're going to be there next year, or that they're going to be there 20 years from now, right? I mean, a substantial number of the masjids in the area, like ICW, used to be churches. Why is it not a church anymore? It's not a church anymore because they didn't have the money or they didn't have the congregation. And I'll bet that 50 years ago, they didn't think that was going to happen to them. Well, at least from the perspective of congregants, right? This doesn't address that. But from the perspective of money, I mean, why don't we have a steady source of income for masjids? Again, I don't know. Maybe there's a law that prohibits them from doing that kind of thing. It definitely doesn't prohibit them from having bookstores and selling books inside the masjid, right?
Yeah, but I think that they would lose their 501(c) status. And I think that's actually the sort of problem that the Islamic community in the U.S. has primarily built itself on the model of the existing primarily Christian organizations, right? Which are not built as businesses, they're built as charitable sort of organizations that rely on donations. And I think that's where that's a terribly bad mistake.
So you're saying you think they lose their tax exempt status?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think they would be much better off. And like, here's the thing, maybe
still be better for them to do it that way, though.
Like, maybe, sake of argument, they can't build, let's say, storefronts immediately adjacent to the mosque. But in that case, go buy out a strip mall.
Yeah. No. Did you see like up on North Avenue? Remember, there's that place that was like Shalimar Banquets, and then right next to it, like, or it's basically, it was part of the giant building, but it was like a separate area of it. They built like 4 stores right there, and they're all clearly Muslim-run stores right there. And it's like, so what if a local masjid were to buy that and have that? So like, there's like 2 places to eat. There's like a clothing shop there. I don't know. I think there's like a dessert place. I don't remember what they all are anymore. But I mean, it's clear. I mean, banquet halls, for goodness sake. I mean, that's probably a way to make a lot of money.
Or use, like, as you're building your mosque, oh my God, what's their name? Istaba Masjid down in Tampa. This is one of the big projects that they did. Is they built this additional very, very large building next to the mosque, and it has like a good dozen rooms that are like banquet hall size, and like they'll have programs there. And we did I worked with Karen that we did a women's self-defense class, and like we just used one of those rooms, right? Like they gave it to us because it was like for one evening, and you know, ta-da, there you go. You got the space without having to have people in the masjid. But the thing is that you don't just rent those stores to Muslims. You rent those stores to whoever wants them. Now, obviously, you want to put in a couple of safeguards like prohibition on making them those check cashing places or
selling
liquor
alcohol
stores, or you know, like. But that's a very few restrictions given what the potential is. But that used to be like you would set that up around the mosque, and now what you have, essentially what you've done is you have surrounded the mosque and your places of education, because that's really what's going on too. You have surrounded them with essentially a market, which means that you have a constant flow of people through that all day, and then the mosque is right there when it's time to pray, right? Like you hear the call for prayers. This still happens in Sarajevo, right? In the old part of town. The call for prayer starts, the shopkeepers get up and they go like, I'll be back in a minute, and then, you know, depending on the level of safety, like sometimes they'll leave like whoever in there, if they have a non-Muslim friend visiting or something like that, the friend will like stay in the shop while they go out so that they don't have to physically lock up. Or they'll lock up, they'll go and pray, you know, that's like, what, 15 minutes, and then they're back, right? And so what it allowed you to do is also sort of to integrate organically, again, the obligations of being a Muslim with all the other things that you do. Right? You don't have to take off half a day to go to a mosque. You're in that mosque, you know, 3 to 4 times a day, because nobody opens at Fajr. So for that, you can use your neighborhood mosque if you have to. But that's the idea, and then so around that you get the community sort of keeps growing, and like when you hit the sort of outer edge of what that mosque can handle, and then these are sort of like center mosques where you have trade going on, then you build another mosque, which now does that, and so they have relatively little overlap, so that each of them is inherently sustainable. Or like they'll just run a different set of things. So if this one over here has primary school and high school, this one will still have a primary school, but it will have a medical center attached to it, or it will have something else. But
right.
yeah,
and the end result, what you get in these cities, in as you say, quote, traditional Islamic cities, right, is you get this setup where there's basically a series of little centers. Instead of having one big center for the whole city, there's a bunch of little ones all around, and they're all just big enough so that you never have an issue where there's a place where you're not going to hear the adhan.
yeah,
And there's some really big benefits to that. It makes it a lot easier to make sure that you're praying all the time. I guess it also makes you a lot more God conscious, right? Because there's always a masjid nearby. You're always hearing the adhan whenever it's time for prayer. And I mean, if the places that you go to and that you hang out at, like the market, or maybe there's a coffee shop right next to the masjid, if you're spending a lot of your time around places that are close to the masjid, then you're probably going to feel a stronger connection to the masjid. On top of the fact that the masjids at this time had a lot of these other things connected to them. So in a way, it's not just a masjid anymore, it becomes like a whole community center.
yeah, and it's sort of perpetually there. What I really like about this, it's when I go to Bosnia, I never have to worry about like, oh, did I pray and where am I going? Literally, like I'll sit down with a bunch of friends for like whatever, coffee, and there's variations in there in how Muslim they are, right? And like we'll be sitting, and you hear the adhan kick off. I mean, there's 83 mosques in the old town of Sarajevo. 83. Right? You can't miss that adhan. And so, like, that kicks off, and from the time I hear the adhan start to the time that I have walked over to that mosque, taken wudu, and am sitting down, the adhan's over. So that's like, what, 5 to 7 minutes on average. So you're never, like here in the US, you're like, okay, well, where am I going? Am I going to be able to pray there? Probably not, because most places don't allow you to pray unless you go to some of these places, like hookah places, by the way, happen to be pretty salah friendly, right? Like even if it's in their back room where the guy's like making stuff, there's like 3 prayer rugs for people or something, right? But like there's very few places you can go out with friends where you can pray. And that means that you have to pray at home, and then, like, especially now, like, imagine now you go out at, like, 3 p.m., it's Asr, and you're going to be out till, like, 8 p.m. That is past Isha. Where are you going to pray?
Right. Yeah, there's a restaurant on North Avenue, and I went there with some friends one time for, it was during Ramadan, basically for iftar. Then they had a whole setup, right? It's basically their parking lot, essentially. They converted a part of their parking lot where cars weren't actually parking in, they converted it into the place where people would pray Maghrib.
That works when it's summer.
Right? Yeah, they have a whole setup for that. I don't know what they do in wintertime.
Nowadays, like, hypothermia might kill you in Salah. But yeah, so this idea of organic integration of the people into their environment. It's not just about whether you're using steel or mud. It's also how that city functions. In Sarajevo, like if you live in the old part of town, you literally do not need a vehicle ever. Ever. Everything is walking distance. Even if you're not like in the center part, like because it's a valley. So if you're like up on one of the sides, which essentially everybody is, there is going to be a local market or two, and there's going to be a local thing. the masjids are like the neighborhood masjids are so close together. I was telling you earlier, you could like if you had a major league pitcher standing on one minaret, he could essentially keep passing that ball minaret to minaret between all 83 mosques, because that's how close they are. Because you have to be able to hear the adhan and walk there in time. Anything further away than that, you sort of miss the point. On top of that, the actual architecture of these places is absolutely astounding. And it doesn't matter if you're in North Africa or if you're in Istanbul or where you are, the traditional designs are built to make you feel what you're sort of supposed to be feeling Islamically, right? Part of something much, much larger and in a sense of calm. I mean, what do you think those all that flowing water is about in like every place where they could get flowing water in around the masjid? Or if you've ever seen the shots of Isfahan in Iran, they have those like very unique turquoise minarets. And then they have these enormous reflecting pools out front, right? And there was like orange trees or like or pomegranate trees, whatever it is there. And it's intended to essentially bring you that sense of Jannah, right? Like by description, it's calm, it's tranquil. There's water, there's beauty all around, right? That's what you're supposed to be surrounded by when you think of the idea of a masjid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and more broadly, one of the ideas you're getting at here is the idea that form follows function, right? So if the intentional function is to remind people about the natural world, remind them about Allah, then the form that you're going to build to get to that will end up following that function. But then that leads to the question, well, what's the function of the modern city? Right? We look at the form of the modern city and we say, okay, what function is this form supposed to support here? What we have in the modern city is a giant downtown area where people go to for typically high-end shopping, and where the firms, businesses that tend to pay their employees huge amounts of money because they make tons of money, those tend to have their offices there because it's very prestigious to be there. And so people come there for work, they come there for fun, and the surrounding neighborhoods, especially as you move farther and farther away from that, tend to be the places where more lower class people live. Until you leave the city and you get to the suburbs, right? The middle class people tend to flee the city, get out to the suburbs where it's nice. So how do they get in? Well, cities tend to be constructed in such a way to have these massive highways all pointing in towards the center of the city. That's kind of the form that it's built. And for the ones that aren't built like right on a lake, like Chicago, you can see a giant loop, right? A highway that goes almost around the city that kind of defines it.
I think Indianapolis has literally, it's a rectangle of highways like right around that downtown area. Same thing with Atlanta. These are places I used to drive through, driving to Florida and back. And so you're like, hey, this is a really interesting layout. But yeah, it's sort of the city radiates out highways, and then there's a sort of that outer limit when you pass from city to not city. And depending on where you are, you either hit the boonies or you hit the suburbs. Shifting gears a little bit from the idea of cities is the idea of Islamic art, and you'll actually find that the same sort of thing in the traditional Islamic music, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the purpose of art as a way of beautifying things and as a way of directing your attention, right? The idea of directing your attention is really the crucial part, right? It's something that stands out, and by the very act of standing out, it pulls your eye towards that, and then what is it that you're supposed to get out of that? And I have I'll actually I don't have that as a lecture. I think I'll do that too. But if you look at, there's a couple of Renaissance versions of David that come out of Italy, and I mean it's David and Goliath, David, right? But all three Davids are done completely differently, right? That they're different parts of the fight, and so the one for the David that was done for Florence is this very young-looking kid. It's all cast in bronze, and he has this just outrageous hat on, and he has this pose. I'm sure you've seen. It's usually women that do it, but it's like your shoulders are slanted one way, and then your hips are slanted the other way with like a hand on hip, and it's a sort of like, oh please kind of pose. And so David has that pose, and he's standing on the decapitated head of Goliath holding a sword in one hand. So it has this like hyper arrogant kind of thing, and that statue was done as a sort of a symbol of Florence at the time, as they were becoming this massive center, and they were sort of becoming a center in opposition to Rome and the papacy that used to control everything. And so like you see that David, so like it pulls your eye, and two, the story that it's telling you is that you don't need to be Goliath, right, to kick all the ass. And that sort of flair of arrogance, which is precisely what Florence was at the time, is like perfectly captured by that image, right? So the Islamic version of that, as Nasr points out, usually didn't have to do with sculpture as sculpture of people and things like that, but instead it moved into geometric patterns, and you will find this kind of a pattern all over the place. It's a kind of design that looks like utter chaos when you initially look at it, and so it stands apart, and so it forces you to pay attention, and then as you pay attention you start automatically picking out patterns in that chaos, because these are just very complex geometric figures. And so you start noticing, like, let's say, repeating circles, and you're like, okay, cool, and then you look at it for like a second longer, and then you realize that there are some squares that are interlocking around these circles, and then there's oblongs, and then there's little spiral radiating things from the center. And so like pretty soon you start seeing how this whole mess of chaos isn't actually chaotic at all. That was just your first impression, and as you look at it, the patterns that form this come out, and you find the name of God present either center of the entire piece or throughout these different patterns that occur all over the place. And so you get this visual idea of drawing order out of chaos through God, right? And you will find that in masjid. It's part of the Alhambra. Definitely, if you take a look, I mean they do that in stone over there. So it's kind of like calligraphy, geometric, everything, but it's actually carved out, like it's part of the wall of the building. So yeah, you see quite a bit of that, and that's not intentionally, right? That's a way of representing the cosmology of Islam through an image, and your brain is supposed to be able to latch onto that. And finally, for music, I mean, we have this whole like, oh, is music haram or is it not? Or like, listen, if you're listening to WAP by Cardi B, that's definitely haram, right? Like there's zero question about that. But what makes it haram isn't the bass in the background, right? Like thump thump thump, like that. That's not the haram part. The haram part is every single word of those lyrics and any combination thereof. But if you listen, you can find just like instrumental stuff or music out of the Middle East, or the music that accompanies the dhikr during Sufi zikr. Right? It's these sorts of things, and again, if you pay attention, you have this movement from simplicity into complexity into what appears to be chaos, as you have like a half dozen musicians interweaving their things. And even though it sounds like chaos, I mean, think of it like if you listen to John Coltrane, it has that sort of explosion of sound kind of thing, a frenzy of auditory stimulus that's happening. But nonetheless, if you pay attention, you can actually pick up what each individual musician is doing. So it seems as if it is a chaos, and yet it's not, right? That there's a definite order to the thing, and so it's the auditory representation of the visual idea. In fact, there's a Muhammad Asad's book, Journey to Mecca. He describes one of these sort of gatherings that he's invited to. I think, oh shoot, is it Syria or is it closer to Saudi? It's something like that. But he because he's a European, he's describing the experience of listening to those musicians, and he's pretty well educated and very well refined. So like his ability to pick out what this music is doing and why, and the impact and the sort of Islamic take on it is pretty good. So I highly recommend that as well. Anything else you want to throw in here? Alright, so y'all can't see it, but he's shaking his head. So I'll take that as a no. Alright, so we are at an hour 12. We'll cut a couple of minutes of that. Alright, so thank you all for tuning in. If you got comments or questions, you can leave them in the comments, or you can email us, and we'll get back to you. Take care. Bye-bye.